First up is a new biopic out on Netflix and is called Nyad, and it centers around Diana Nyad, who is a swimmer, and she accomplished this amazing feat. She swam from Cuba to Florida, which no one had ever done before. It was about 110 miles in the end because swimming is not a straight line, obviously there are currents, etc. And just to, make it even more impressive, she did it in her 60s. She attempted it for the first time, I think, when she was in her late 20s, early 30s, and unfortunately didn't succeed, and then decided in her 60s, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and actually accomplish this, and she did, which is very impressive. The film is directed by Chai Vasarhelyi and Jimmy Chin, and they are a directing duo who are probably better known for their documentaries. If you saw Free Solo, that's them. They do a lot of sort of sports athlete-based stuff, and so it's very clear that they are familiar with that storytelling structure and how to tell like those characters. But I think the challenge for them in dipping into this sort of dramatic fictionalized narrative part is dealing with layering in the components that are like the backstory and which elements do we leave in and leave out. Free Solo got to focus really on the present. It goes into the motivations and like the histories of the characters, obviously, but this one, I think the biggest struggle with it is I feel like they were trying to overcompensate for dipping into fiction, and so they were bringing in all these elements from her past, which inform her future as a character, obviously, but there are some pretty heavy, important things that they only scratch the surface on, and I'm like, if you're going to introduce this, which is important because it sounds like it's an important formative part of who Diana Nyad is as a character, you need to give it time to breathe, and you need to show us earlier on, I think, how it impacts her. I think they rely on implications to show like, oh, this thing will come back later, and this is why this matters, but it's sort of almost too soft, and I firmly believe in directors trusting their audiences, and it's not that you don't pick it up, but then when they actually do sort of openly address, and I don't even think they fully openly address certain parts of it, but I'm trying to sort of dance around it in case it is a thing you're unaware of, but I don't want to spoil it. But there's just sort of like an unevenness to bringing in any of the components that aren't directly related to the active participation in the swim that I think that they are not as strong on as they could have been, or even there's moments where she's like talking to a classroom full of children and you're like, okay, what are you trying to tell us here? And could you have just shown us instead of telling us by having them tell children who are, you're basically calling us children as stand-ins for the audience, So there were moments like that I didn't love, I think the challenge with a sports story, like I absolutely love that it is, a story that I don't think a lot of us are familiar with, even though it happened not that long ago, like the actual accomplishment happened that long ago. I love that it's centering around, effectively like ARP-aged people to show that, one, you don't have to be like 14 to be the greatest new athlete in the world. Like your athletic life can contribute beyond, Annette Bening and Jodie Foster are both pretty great in this. Annette, I know people, we focus a lot on how actresses look and age and all that stuff. I like that Annette Bening is age appropriate for this. I like that she's willing to look age appropriate for this. I like that she, Annette Bening's gorgeous, but she's just like, yeah, this is a swimmer who's out in the sun all the time and all, she's not afraid of looking what like a 60-year-old woman would look like. So more power to her, although it shouldn't be something that we have to be applauding, but it's unlike a lot of the other things we see, so it stands out in that sense. The story is a decent sports story. I don't know if I felt as much suspense as I wanted to. When it came to the actual athletic accomplishment, I've actually seen a couple other movies that deal with this sort of like marathon level swimming, and those felt a little more perilous to me, intentionally. I don't know if this was trying to be, I don't think this film was trying to scare people away from the swimming, but even in the moments it was very clear that I should have felt concerned for the character. I don't know if they as accurately conveyed the gravity of some of the situations as well as they could have. But aside from that, it's a safe, fine watch. I don't think it's going to win anyone any awards, but I also admire a good story of accomplishment, so I'm going to give it a 3.4 out of 5. The next film I have is called Quiz Lady and is out on Hulu, and I wanted to adore this movie. I wanted to be obsessed with this movie because the premise of it is that it centers around two Asian sisters, and in real life I am an Asian sister, and one of them is just like a quiz savant and has the opportunity to go on a quiz show that's, let's be honest, it's basically Jeopardy. And Jeopardy is the one show in my house with my immediate family that we can all watch without going to each other's throats or people talking through. It is like the safe show. Everything else we cannot watch as a family unit, but Jeopardy is our show. And clearly, the writer of this, Jen D'Angelo, loves Jeopardy. And maybe she had some help from other people because there are some specific things I'm like, oh, these people have been watching Jeopardy in the last however many years. There are a couple like nods that if you're a Jeopardy super fan, you'd be like, I know exactly who that's in reference to. So I was like, I'm in. I'm sold. You've got Awkwafina and Sandra Oh playing the sisters. Jason Schwartzman is one of the other competitors on the quiz show. Holland Taylor's in it. Tony Hale. Will Ferrell plays the basically Alex Trebek character. And SNL fans, I just want to warn you now, he's playing a very earnest version of it versus the Trebek we get on Saturday Night Live, which I actually thought worked really well. It's just sort of like, oh yes, let's not lie. He does look kind of like Alex Trebek. And so, but he took it on very earnestly. He is a producer on this film, so you could tell he wants it to succeed. Now, the problem for me with this movie is that if it had just been about the sort of trying to get to the quiz show and trying to win and this sibling dynamic and all that stuff, I think it would have been so great. Those parts really shone for me. The challenge was there's this extra sort of convoluted plot line that's in the trailer, so I'm not spoiling anything, about the reason that they are competing on this show, or that Awkwafina's character, she's actually a savant. So it's an interesting also sort of typecasting switch where Awkwafina plays the kind of more dull, drab, everyday, quiz-obsessed, factoid-obsessed sister, and Sandra Oh plays this delinquent older sister. So you'd think, based on their casting histories, it would have been the opposite, where Awkwafina is playing the sort of troublemaker, etc., and Sandra Oh is playing the, more stoic, serious one. But, they're both great actors, and so they were able to pull it off. But anyway, the reason that they go on the show is because their mother gets into debt and, runs off, and the debt collector comes and is like, hey, you need to, settle up on behalf of her. And so in order to win money very quickly, they somehow end up on the show, which is also not how game show casting hosts. But anyway, that part of it ended up being, I saw what they were trying to do, and there were a couple of cultural jokes out of it that I was like, oh, is this how you and why you are inserting this into it? Because I did like some of those, but I felt it was strongest when it was focusing on the sort of trying to get the sister out of the shell. And I think there's a way that they could have done this that didn't require the sort of exaggerated circumstances through which, the gambling and the mobsters, all that stuff, it was just like, this feels so extreme in a world where you've actually set up relatively grounded characters. So that was my biggest challenge with it. But then when they got into the actual quiz stuff, I loved it. There's some odd moments that I didn't want to spoil. I think, like I said, Awkwafina and Sandra Oh, I normally would not have expected the two of them cast in those particular sort of character archetypes. I think they did fine. I think Sandra Oh getting to let loose was actually very fun to watch. Jason Schwartzman, I don't want to go into too much into spoilers into this, but he plays, I'll just say it, he plays like a Ken Jennings type. I don't think he's supposed to be exactly Ken Jennings, but I was just like, oh, I see what's happening. I just appreciated that. There are a bunch of esoteric moments in it that I really enjoyed, but overall, it didn't quite elevate to that level of cult classic for me, where I was like, oh, I will watch this over and over. In fact, I was trying to decide, do I recommend this to my parents? Will they find it funny? I know they'll get the Jeopardy stuff, but because of all the other things sort of peppered in, did this become too strange, but not strange enough to recommend to them? And I think at the end of the day, I'm going to say, yeah, it's fine, watch it to them, but I wouldn't be like, oh my God, I'm so excited for you to see Quiz Lady, which is a bummer because they are also in this sort of target audience for it. But overall, I think it's still fun. I will give it a 3 out of 5. The last film I have this week is called The Marsh King's Daughter, and yes, this is a real film that is coming out wide in theaters. I had not heard anything about it, pretty much. Apparently, it's based on a novel of the same name. Haven't read the novel either, so I can't speak to it as an adaptation. But it stars Daisy Ridley and Ben Mendelsohn, so I was like, I guess I'm in. I will watch whatever this movie is and see how it goes. The director is Neil Berger, and he is probably best known for the Divergent series. He also directed Limitless and The Illusionist, although I was more of a prestige person of those two competing magician films. But anyway, the premise of the film is that Ben Mendelsohn's character is basically a very bad man, and he kidnaps a woman and then, effectively gets her pregnant and keeps her out in the marsh for a very long time. The girl doesn't know she's a byproduct of assault, and so she just thinks this is her dad, and she loves him. The young version of the character is played by Brooklyn Prince from The Florida Project, who it took me a minute to recognize. I was like, who is this girl? She's actually very good. So, young her, very good. Eventually, gets caught, goes to jail, and the girl is, they escape the wilderness or the marsh, and she grows up. And then the adult version is played by Daisy Ridley, who I'm a big fan of. I'm a big Ben Mendelsohn fan. Garrett Hedlund plays Daisy Ridley's character's husband. Gil Birmingham plays a police officer. And so most of the people, if not all the people involved, at least acting-wise, I'm a fan of. So I have to go, is this the script's fault, ? Or is this the director's fault? Or what's going on here? For something that is sort of kind of true crime-y, which, very hot right now, it doesn't ever feel truly suspenseful. Like, there are suspenseful moments that it builds in it, and yet, even though unlike something like Nyad, where I kind of know how it's going to end, and that was also one of my problems with that, and that I was like, I know objectively, logically, that this should be a suspenseful moment, but I am not feeling it in my body. The same thing is applicable to the Marsh King's daughter, where, basically Ben Mendelsohn escapes, and so Daisy Ridley needs to figure out what's going on, and she's worried about him coming after her, and all this sort of other stuff, and there was just sort of a disconnect there, I think. And there's all this stuff. Again, I don't know if this is all in the novel and it's better conveyed, but Ben Mendelsohn's character, like when she's a little kid, and this is not too spoiler, it happens very early, self-tattoos her and gives her all these symbols that are indigenous people symbols, and, being corrupted, obviously. There were a lot of moments where I was like, that should be infected. Like, these are way too clean for the way that they are applied to have turned out the way they did. But I didn't love that part of it. Like, the tattooing of a minor aside with a quill, I was like, how are we? It felt like it wanted to be very spiritual in a way, and was trying to figure out how to do it without being too appropriating, and therefore it just didn't know how to do it. But it's a whole plot line, and I was just like, this just feels silly and undermines the sense as an audience of investment and thrill, and it just feels, it kind of cheapens it a little bit, and it might be an integral part of the story, but the way it's conveyed in the film does not make it feel that way. So sadly, as much as I like the actors involved, I don't think in good conscience I can recommend this. It kind of reminded me, it feels like a less romantic Where the Crawdads Sing, but I didn't like that movie particularly either. So I think there is a reason that this has not been being pushed on folks, because I think they know generally that it might not be the strongest effort for everyone. And I know it's very hard to make a movie and a lot of effort goes involved and there are a lot of people, so I don't want to completely crap on it, because it's not the worst thing I've seen, but it wasn't good. And I wouldn't feel great about telling anyone, oh yes, you should absolutely go see this movie. If you loved the book and you're like, I gotta see it, I'm not gonna tell you not to. It's not so bad that I'm like, no, really, please don't go see this film. But if you were thinking about it, if you were on the cusp, I'm gonna only give it a 2.5 out of 5 for me. So use your best judgment.